I'm very happy and privileged to introduce our speaker, and I will be giving him the word in a few minutes. Just for those who haven't been participating before in these meetings that have taken place the last 1.5 years, this is organized by an international association called Initiatives of Change, and more specifically by a program of Initiatives of Change called Initiatives of Change in Business and the Economy. And it's a kind of an umbrella for all the initiatives taken by members of Initiatives of Change across the world on the business and economy theme, with a vision to contribute to a more peaceful, more just, and more sustainable world. It's a very, very big goal, but we do that by trying to inspire, equip, and connect people in business who want to go in that direction, to develop a value-based leadership training, to provide a safe space for economic leaders to exchange their ideas and experiences. And that's what we are doing today. And of course, this goes with a measure of confidentiality. You don't quote people outside if you haven't asked the permission, but you can ask, of course, and you can also quote without naming anyone. We've been very thrilled in a very few months to have a number of occasions to reflect on sustainability and what it takes to become sustainable for a company, or for more globally for the economy. And today we'll have an exposure to a very, very key topic, which is the energy topic. And for that, we are very privileged to have Rick Westerdale with us. He has, well, I think his resume is a bit in the invitation, but just to remind everyone, he has been in various positions. One was a senior advisor with the United States Department of State for several years, where he advised particularly on energy policy priorities. He was also an executive with a major oil company, ExxonMobil, and he's now an investor, shall I say, and an advisor. Is that correct, Rick?
Yes, that's good, Antoine.
Yes, good. So we are very happy to give you the word now for your presentation, which I know will be very, very high quality, so be all very attentive.
Well, you're very kind, Antoine, and thank you for that gracious introduction. And hopefully, let me go ahead and get this presentation up here and shared so everyone can see it. Let me make sure. Is everyone able to see the presentation deck?
Excellent for me. Yeah, good.
Please put it on full screen, Rick, if possible.
1 second, I shall do that. It is one of the challenges. Let's just bear with me 1 second. We'll go into slideshow mode. How's that? A little bit better?
Great. Yeah.
All right. Well, without further ado, I want to thank you all for allowing me to speak with this group today. I find it very good that we still have venues. Yes. Can everyone hear me?
I think someone came in with the mic open. So now close your mics if you're not speaking, please. Thank you.
All right. Thank you again. And I just want to say how much I appreciate the invitation to be here today and to have an opportunity to speak with you all on the challenge of energy. It is refreshing to find a venue where we're actually able to have an open and candid conversation. This is, in my estimation, one of the most important topics that really affects all of us today. Now, my goal during this overview that I'll present is not to make anyone an energy expert, but rather to provide some thought-provoking commentary to facilitate a further dialogue. I'm happy to be here and appreciate the organizers for putting this together. And without further ado, let me go ahead and jump into my presentation, if you will. You know, we really are in an interesting period in time. And quite frankly, the world has changed. Many of us grew up in a time and an age where OPEC countries produced and OECD countries consumed energy. But really what we're seeing today is a very different picture. And I want to explore the nexus of energy, the nexus of economic development, energy security and supply, and the environment. It is something that really permeates all walks of life. If you think about it, the access to energy is our ability to live our everyday life, whether it's talking on this video conference, whether it's driving our car, whether it's going to work and turning the lights on, energy sits at the heart of that. And what we've seen is we really have seen a uniquely volatile period for the global energy markets. What has happened is there really are three primary, or what I call driving factors. We're coming out of the global pandemic, and we all understand the implications of that. We've seen everything from supply disruptions to demand destruction to all of us being in lockdowns. And now as we recover, all of us are watching economically the inflationary impacts that we've seen. Secondly, and from an energy security and supply standpoint, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has really tightened global energy markets, specifically oil and gas markets, fossil fuels, which are a primary source of energy today. And all of this is happening on the backdrop of global climate change and the implications associated with the Paris Agreement and the commitments that all of the countries around the world have made toward that. Whether you think of this as a three-legged stool where each of the legs, whether it's the economic, the security and the supply, or the environment, all have to be in equal proportion for that stool to stand up, or whether you think of it otherwise, these three factors are what are really pulling the markets and what we're seeing driving part of our economic recovery post-COVID. And so I'll explore each in a little more depth as we go through this presentation. But the other thing that I really need to note at the onset is deglobalization is really accelerating. And what we're seeing is a world that's been split or is being split into really two blocks. You have the democratic nations and you have authoritarian nations. And I'll also talk to that theme as we go through this presentation. So let us go ahead and dig in. So what's changed? I said the world has changed. And what we saw in early 2022 this year is that we started what many of us thought to be a recovery from the global pandemic. And in terms of energy, we saw energy demand really recover to near pre-pandemic levels. However, there are two factors as you peel back that onion that one has to consider and think about. The first is that global energy markets had tightened due to years of underinvestment, and that only was compounded by COVID, when capital investment dried up and discretionary investment dried up. And that's what we saw early this year, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that the global energy markets were already starting to tighten, a key indicator of that being oil and natural gas prices. The second factor that you have to think about is the supply chain disruptions. What we found from COVID is that things were in the wrong places. There was a backlog, and we're even still seeing that today with what's happened in China with the lockdowns. And I'll talk a little more to that in just a moment. Secondly, we all were, quite frankly, a bit surprised, but certainly concerned over Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the resulting sanctions, the resounding sanctions that we have seen as a response to that. And that, again, further amplified this tightening of the global energy markets. And there's been a true economic impact from an inflationary standpoint. What this has also done is this has accelerated the deglobalization. You've started to see this China-Russia alliance, and I'll talk more to that as well as OPEC's response in just a moment. And finally, the energy transition is that backdrop. As we all recognize, one of the most consequential things that we face today is global climate change. And that really was driving many of the policies that we've seen around the world post the Paris Agreement implementation and countries' commitments to reduce the level of emissions and the CO2 footprint associated with each of the countries. In the European, the EU geography or region, what we have seen is we've seen a true focus on renewables. However, that has also resulted in more of a reliance on imported energy and specific natural gas. And I'll show you all a little bit about that at the moment. Here in the US, we saw a very strong response with the new administration, the Biden administration, and they've implemented some really strong regulatory measures. And quite frankly, those have resulted in financial barriers to fossil fuel investment. All this is leading to what we're seeing happen to the global economy today. So let's go a little further into detail. If you look at the 2 years into the pandemic, and this snapshot that we're looking at is a proxy for energy. I'm looking at the historical and projected global oil demand. And many of us thought starting this year that we were going to see a nice hockey stick, if you will, recovery from the global pandemic. Certainly that green dashed line you see on the right-hand side of this graph has been a whole lot more choppy, but many of us were very, if you will, optimistic at the start of this year that we were ready to see a true global recovery from the pandemic. And we're actually starting to see that now, but it certainly has not been a smooth line, as we all noted and have seen. Furthermore, I talked a little bit about the investment lagging behind demand. There's no better example of an interconnected economy than the global oil markets and the global energy markets. And what happens in one part of the world affects the world as a whole. What we've seen happen over the past 7 years really is a collapse, a reduction in global upstream spending. With a finite resource such as fossil fuels, oil and natural gas, you have a natural decline. So you have to continue to invest in order to maintain current levels of production, let alone grow production to meet the increasing energy demand globally. And what we've seen in the past decade is a trend away from fossil fuels, oil and gas, and less investment. I think what's also very interesting here, we're looking at about half the level of investment short, give or take 7 years ago. But what's also interesting here is that investment is happening internationally. And really, I'll talk about it, but it has been concentrated in a few key countries. I mentioned supply chain disruptions, and they persist today. But I think this chart from the IMF is particularly instructive. If you look at the start of the global pandemic, we saw huge disruptions to our supply chains. And a lot of that started to rebalance over time into late 2020 and early 2021. However, if you look at the right-hand side of the graph, we are still seeing a large amount of global supply disruptions now, whether that's consumer goods and products or whether that's in the global energy market. But all of these factors have really had an impact on our economies, not just in Europe, not just here in the US, but globally, as the goods that are necessary because of these longer supply chains we're finding are in the wrong place or are backlogged, and the impact has been higher transportation costs, and ultimately a cost being passed on to the consumer. What has that actually done when you add to it the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Well, it's really accelerated a trend that we're seeing more and more, which is toward a deglobalization. And that was on the onset of this discussion. I mentioned it, but if you look, ever since the global financial crisis, you've seen a trend line. It's been a little bit choppy, as you can see in the graph here on the left-hand side of the screen here, but you've seen a trend toward deglobalization. What we're actually seeing now is with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we're actually seeing that accelerate. Folks are becoming more and more sensitive to the security of supply, whether that's in the energy arena or whether it's in normal goods, manufactured goods that are necessary. And you're seeing folks trending toward having, if you will, repatriating those supply sources closer to home or at home. And all of this is having a highly inflationary impact on the global economy. What has been the response by the West in particular to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And I want to step back in time to 2014. You know, it's interesting, if you look at this through the energy lens, you know, energy can be a true source of cooperation or, in fact, a source of conflict. And dating back to early 2014, what we saw is prior to Crimea, we saw a situation which, in fact, was a commercial dispute. Russia had supplied natural gas to Ukraine. Ukraine was in arrears, and Russia ultimately, as you all will recall, stopped the flow of natural gas as a result of those arrears. And then ultimately things escalated to the incursion, as we called it at the time as a diplomat, into Ukraine or Crimea. And now we're seeing even further with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we're seeing a tremendous impact. Now, one thing that has been resounding has been the West's response. This is perhaps the most substantive set of sanctions that we've seen. Everything from sanctions on companies, individuals. We're looking at the banking system and the SWIFT system, and the US and many countries in Europe have followed, has put a total block on the purchase of Russian oil and gas. If you think about it, Russian oil and oil exports in particular, global oil markets, just to give you some perspective, are close to 100 million barrels a day. Russia's exports represented 4% of that. And what we have seen a decline in the global supply of oil, therefore affecting energy writ large. And I'll delve a little further into that in a second. But what we've seen is these measures have actually resulted in a further escalation by each side. And as a counter, Russia is actually requiring payment for energy, specifically oil and natural gas, now in rubles. What's interesting is post-World War II, the global financial system has been based, international trade has been based on the US dollar. And what we're seeing is this trend away from the US dollar also has potential implications globally for the global economy, certainly for us domestically here at the US, because it really gets down to foreign currency reserves held by countries. And as you see countries go away from one basket or one currency to another, those trade balances change and the global economy changes. And quite frankly, this is an area that I'm watching very closely because China for many years has looked to set up an alternative financial system to the pre-existing post-World War II OECD system. And what's really interesting here is that has a real implication domestically here in the US, but internationally. And it can further impact inflationary pressures or perhaps even push us further toward a global recession. More to come on that. If we look at the energy price shocks that we have seen as sanctions are implemented, what we've seen is we've seen energy costs globally. Looking at the chart on the left, you look at where we were in terms of the price of oil per barrel, where we are today, which is in that kind of $110 to $120 a barrel, and where potentially we could go. Now, with global oil, that is perhaps one of the most fungible commodities that moves internationally in terms of trade and around the world. But that really is a lead indicator for us of the economic tightening and the inflationary pressures. Similarly, if you look at the European gas price, you know, what we're seeing is we do see a demand elasticity, meaning there are alternatives to help replace that natural gas, and we'll look at those. However, look at that price per millions of cubic feet of natural gas and the direction that that's going. And this has even transitioned into the price of coal. And I know from a climate perspective, we've all certainly in Europe and here in the US have transitioned away from coal as a primary source of power generation. However, it is one of those alternatives that is being considered, and we're actually seeing the consumption of coal, not just in the East, in the Asian or the developing countries, we're also seeing it increase in Europe to replace some of the supplies from Russia. So what does that look like? And really, Europe's energy transition was well and truly underway. And if you look at the power generation mix by fuel type, you can see there's been a market share gain, certainly since 2010, of about 18% for renewables there in Europe. That's the EU and UK. And at the same time, the offset has been the reduction in coal-fired power generation. One thing that I'll point out here is that natural gas has remained relatively flat. And what's interesting is alternative and renewables certainly provide an opportunity for us to move toward that 1.5 degree global climate change goal. However, they are intermittent power sources when the sun shines or the wind blows. And so looking at that base load, if you will, power generation, natural gas has really filled that void. But what we've seen out of Germany as an example is it also has certainly made certain countries more vulnerable to blackouts and supply disruptions. If we look a little further into the natural gas, we've seen natural gas share of power generation, as I mentioned, has really been constant over the past decade. However, as Europe has transitioned away from fossil fuels, and as, for instance, the North Sea or other natural gas supply sources have declined, we're actually seeing an increased dependency on Russian pipeline natural gas. And you can see that somewhere in the order of 18 billion cubic feet per day. Now, I will also point out for you the graph in the lower left-hand portion of this slide, because what's also quite concerning is the European inventories of natural gas have fallen almost to historic lows. And that's concerning not just as we come out of winter, but as we look at the next 2 winters ahead. And you think about that because it's not just today. This transition away from Russian energy as a result of the sanctions that have been placed on Russia for their invasion of Ukraine, it's not as easy to transition away from that supply source. It's a natural supply source because of its proximity to Europe. However, it's not as easy, as I'll show in the upcoming slides, to just simply transition away from it. And one of the ways that Europe has looked at that very closely is regasification, liquid natural gas. So natural gas, if you think about it, was initially a byproduct from oil production. And then we became smarter about how we use this source of energy, which has about 1/6 of the energy content of oil. And we actually started using it close to that supply source. Ultimately, the global markets have become interconnected through liquid natural gas, which is just the supercooling of natural gas and transitioning it from a gaseous state to a liquid state so it can be loaded on ships. Now, if you look, you've got a supply shortage of roughly 18 billion cubic feet per day. But what is the nameplate capacity that exists today in Europe? It's under that. So there has to be some alternatives. And if you look at the amount of natural gas being brought into Europe, it isn't sufficient to fill that void. So that makes us have to look not just at new LNG supply sources that can come on stream or be brought to bear. We saw some of that. We saw a redirection of LNG from Asia into Europe at the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and this implementation of sanctions. But we need additional volumes on the global market in order to be able to not only sustain the pre-existing demand in Europe, but also that in Asia. I mentioned there's really no quick fix. And if you consider some of the things that have been ongoing and some of the ways that one could replace the supply of Russian natural gas or even oil into Europe, you know, you think about things like reconsidering the phase out of some of the nuclear plants that were imminent. You know, looking again, and none of us likes this in light of global climate change, and I'd mentioned using some of that coal-fired power generation. Certainly everyone has been focused on LNG imports. And, you know, the problem with that is the supply chain takes time and significant capital to happen. We've seen the build out of additional regasification capacity across Europe, meaning the ability to import, but we're not seeing the same level of investment around the world in additional sources of supply. One often hears this is a pivotal moment and an opportunity to double down and invest in renewables. However, just like we've seen in other areas, there are challenges to that, and it does take a bit of time. I do see some very promising developments in the area of hydrogen, and I know that's something that's been very topical in Europe. But again, those investments take time and resources. They take capital, equipment, materials, and we'll talk about some of those materials. And, you know, it's even been talked about adding to the nuclear capacity available in Europe. But these are not quick or easy fixes. And you can see that tension that occurs between policy on the environmental aspects as well as the investment aspects. So can the US LNG save Europe? Certainly the US has ample supply of natural gas. And we've certainly seen a flotilla of LNG coming to Europe in the past year. However, here domestically in the US, we've actually seen, if you will, a restriction or a constricted fossil fuel supply in favor of climate-friendly alternatives. And much like we saw in terms of the transition from coal to natural gas here domestically, we're seeing now oil and natural gas to some extent struggling to obtain the finance because of ESG measures, because of restrictive regulatory environment. And the bottom line is, even if we're able to produce the natural gas necessary to meet that 18 BCFD, billions of cubic feet per day, that Europe needs right now to replace Russian natural gas, there are infrastructure constraints and bottlenecks that include the pipelines and also include, just frankly, greenfield facilities. The short answer is we can help, we're doing that, but we're not a silver bullet, we're not the answer. So where do we look? Where are the alternatives? You know, it's really interesting, and I touched upon this a little bit earlier, but OPEC Plus has been reluctant to increase oil production and continues to pivot east. And, you know, some think, well, that's geopolitical. It's actually economics 101. Their market is drying up in Europe and here in the US. And that pivot east is a natural pivot where the demand, the developing non-OECD countries that need cheap, ample, and reliable sources of energy to fuel their economic development, let alone help to meet that almost 1 billion people today without consistent forms of energy. But it also comes at a time where the surplus capacity, or if you will, the global swing capacity, coming out of the oil and gas sector, we always had a rule of thumb. We needed about 5% swing capacity in the global oil markets in order to be able to offset natural disasters or acts of war or black swan events. Today, globally, there's only about 2% swing capacity. And quite frankly, that's held in some places, predominantly in OPEC countries, that have authoritarian regimes that we're concerned about from a human rights and other perspective. But, you know, fortunately, what we saw last week was OPEC Plus has decided to slightly increase their production, which is already helping. But those pressures will remain on the global oil markets as we move forward. You think about Iran, that is a wild card. The JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, will we actually get back to the table and reach an agreement? And if so, that could supply additional volumes of both oil and natural gas to a hungry international marketplace. Venezuela has been really interesting. And I know there have been some high-level dialogues between the US and Venezuela. Both Iran and Venezuela face similar restrictions and sanctions as to what we've seen with Russia. And there have been some discussions, can we bring Venezuelan oil, heavy oil, back into the marketplace? And certainly Saudi Arabia has between 1 million, 1.5 million barrels of surplus or swing capacity. What do I mean by swing capacity? It's the ability to turn on the tap, that is to start production within 30 days, and then to be able to sustain it for more than 90 days. So where do we go from here? And what does this look like in terms of global climate change? You know, we're really, and I use the climate action tracker here in the thermometer because I think it's a good indicator of where we are. If you look at policies and actions today, we're looking at about a 2.5 to 2.7 degrees Celsius climate change by, you know, kind of that 2050 or 2021. The year 2100, which is not sustainable. We all recognize that our response to global warming is one of the most consequential public policy debates that's taking place. And if you look at the 2030 targets, they reduce that slightly. The pledges post-Paris and what countries are doing a little further. And if we take the optimistic outlook, much like the IEA or others, that still doesn't get us there. It leaves us with a gap. And where are we today? As of the end of 2021, we're on that trajectory to about a 1.2 degree Celsius warming. So when we talk about building a sustainable and reliable future, the choices we make today are ever important. And what are some of those choices, and what are the tensions that we face? You know, I mentioned earlier that there's really no silver bullet, but as companies, governments, and investors alike grapple with these questions, you know, we really have to recognize that both traditional and alternative sources of energy are going to be necessary, given what we've seen in terms of energy security or the economic implications associated with sustainable change. You know, we really have to optimize the existing assets and have a thoughtful transition over the next several decades, considering the societal and regulatory demands that exist if we're going to achieve climate change. And really, we need a level playing field, one free of distortions, one that everyone agrees to the set of rules. I'll give you the best example. You know, I mentioned to my friends Antoine and Manier before we started this conversation today that we're having a beautiful day here in Washington, D.C. But it wasn't that long ago, D.C. and Los Angeles, and Manier just visited Los Angeles, which is why we were talking about this, faced a real challenge in terms of air quality. And that air quality was much like Beijing prior to their Olympics. And today they have very free and clear skies, quite enjoyable. Well, California here in the US has placed some of the most restrictive environmental constraints on power generation, manufacturing, and writ large in terms of the fuels they use. However, what they did is they did what we call NIMBY, not in my backyard, pushing coal-fired power generation and other more carbon-intensive sources of energy just across the state line or outside their borders. So when I say creating a level playing field, it's not just about cleaning up your backyard, but it's making sure that in doing so, you don't push that over into your neighbor's yard. And part of that is how we measure. And the true measurement should be the lowest cost of energy with the greatest amount of avoided CO2 and a consistent standard across the board. And finally, we've got to think about not just the environment in terms of emissions, but we also have to think about the supply chain, that the materials that are necessary, and also having a skilled workforce. And that's one of the challenges we face today in terms of global climate change, is having the workforce necessary to provide the solutions to the problems and the challenges we face today. Along those lines, and I mentioned the supply chains, assuming that there's a political will for decarbonization, do we have the resources? I really like this graphic on the screen here because it brings home the amount of rare earths and minerals that are going to be required to facilitate the energy transition. Let's talk minerals for a moment. If you look at this chart on the left-hand portion of the chart, look at the amount of copper that goes into an EV, let alone into onshore wind or even solar power generation. We are going to need more than double the amount of copper that's produced today globally if we're going to achieve this energy transition, let alone the rare earths that go into it. And I think what is particularly interesting is when you look at that value chain, and specifically the bottom half of this chart, where do those rare earths, where do those minerals exist? They're not in the West, folks. They're predominantly in the East. And many of them today are controlled by China, and many are also controlled by Asian and African countries. But China comes to the forefront, and their Belts and Roads initiative has actually, if you will, secured long-term those supplies. Why is this important? If you look at what's happening, and this is another good chart from the IEA, and I used to represent the US on the governing board of the IEA, so I really appreciate the work that they do. In 2019, the global trade associated with energy was $1.5 trillion, made up predominantly of oil, natural gas, and coal. If you look out over the next 2 to 3 decades, you actually see a significant shift. And if you look at the boxes in the far right-hand side, critical minerals, hydrogen, if we're actually going to achieve this net zero, will dominate that trade. And so are we trading OPEC countries for China? Is a real question here. And are we prepared for that and the implications of that? So let me just conclude with a few comments here. And I'm looking forward to really getting into a good, wholesome conversation. You know, energy sits at this nexus of economic development, national security, and environmental responsibility. And it really permeates all areas. And while many of us, whether it's in the international space, the financial space, the private sector, or the government sector, we're all really equipped to manage risk. But uncertainty is something we struggle with. There is no one silver bullet. So we really have to address all of these factors in parallel. And what we're seeing happening is the world is splitting apart. It's pushing toward these two very different trading blocks, and that's further constraining supply chains and, quite frankly, hindering our economic recovery, but also global trade. Are the materials that we need in the right place? Are the manufactured goods where we need them most? To maintain energy security, we've got to acknowledge the role that hydrocarbons play. And quite frankly, I'm encouraged by some of the work that's being done in the oil and gas sector to not only capture their emissions, but to deal with those and to transition toward more sustainable, less carbon intensive forms of energy. But we've got to understand there's a balance that has to be reached. And we have to think about those nearly 1 billion people in the world today without access to consistent forms of energy, whether it's the electricity that we all take for granted in our homes or using today on this video conference, or whether it's even clean, if you will, cooking fuel. So many folks use primary forms of energy around the world. That's something that the UN has been working to address for decades now. And finally, this energy transition must be managed thoughtfully to avoid the unintended consequences. So I'll kind of stop there. I know in the chat there were several questions. I'm happy to circle back to those, but I wanted to at least use this as a starting point for us to have a dialogue and a conversation. And I hope you found it thought-provoking. Antoine?
Thank you very much, Rick, for this very in-depth analysis and very professional views that are sustained by facts and figures. We are certainly having a lot of questions, and I would like to start by mentioning a few understanding or comprehension questions.